Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
Good afternoon, Team Krulak community. Thank you for your patience. My name is Major Ian Brown. I'm the Operations Officer here at the Brute Krulak Center for Innovation and Creativity. And on behalf of Marine Corps University, the Marine Corps University Foundation, and the Krulak Center, welcome back to the Brutecast, our series designed to connect the worlds of the warfighter and PME with the best in innovative and creative thought. Before we begin, please remember that all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not reflect the views of the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, the United States Marine Corps, or any other agency of the U.S. government. We will also be recording this webcast for the benefit of those in our community of interest who can't join us live today. So we ask that you be mindful of keeping your microphones muted to avoid disrupting the presentation and keeping your webcams off until you ask a question to help us stream smoothly. We will have a question and answer following the presentation. So if you do have a question as we're going along here, just go ahead and type it into the chat, and then we will call on you in the order they're received to ask your question directly if your equipment supports that. So today we are very excited to host the newest member of Team Krulak to the Brutecast, and I'll turn things over to Dr. Amin Tarzi, our Director of Middle East Studies, to introduce our guest. Dr. Tarzi, over to you.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. And Major Brown, thank you very much for hosting this session and every other session. It is a pleasure and for the Middle East Studies and Krulak Center to introduce our newest colleague, Dr. Christopher Anzalone, who joined us just 2 weeks ago. Dr. Anzalone is the new Research Assistant Professor at Middle East Studies. He studied at George Mason University right here in Northern Virginia, completing a BA, double major in History and Religious Studies. He did his graduate work at Indiana University, Bloomington, completing an MA in Near Eastern Studies, and earned his doctorate through McGill University in Montreal, Canada, in Islamic Studies with primary geographical focus on the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa, in particular East Africa, and additional research on South Asia. His main area of research focuses broadly on contemporary Islam in Muslim societies, with a particular interest on Islamic political thought and different Muslim and social political movements. Dr. Anzalone has special interest in radical and militant Islamist movements and organizations, both Sunni and Shiite, and issues of sectarianism in Islam. His dissertation and ongoing early stage first book project looks at the use of symbols and symbolic power as a tool of soft power by Islamist, rebel, or insurgent groups that seek to set up proto-state or territorial governance. For example, Al-Shabab in Somalia and the Islamic State, ISIS or ISIL. Dr. Anzalone, welcome aboard, and we turn over the stage to you, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Tarzi, and thank you, Major Brown, for hosting me, and I'm very happy to join the Krulak team. So today I'm going to be speaking about, I'm just going to switch the video off and I'll turn it back on for the Q&A. But today I'm going to be talking about my first book project, which is based on my dissertation, or at least a sort of part of my dissertation, which is looking at sort of the use of symbols and symbolic repertoires or collections of symbols, and symbolic power as a kind of soft power to augment sort of hard power, military power, force, basically physical force, by militant Islamists, Sunni militant Islamists, or Jihadi rebel/insurgent groups. Today I'm going to focus primarily on Al-Shabab, but may make some comments about ISIS core in Syria and Iraq, particularly from 2013-14 until about the end of 2017, when, of course, it lost most of its territorial holdings. So this, all of the images, actually, just my work draws a lot on sort of visual primary sources, and so all of the images, not the two maps that you'll see in a bit, but all of the images are actually from insurgents, are by the insurgents themselves, by Al-Shabab, or in some cases by ISIS itself. And so just briefly, so the map of Somalia and Somaliland, actually, which would be in the far north, Somaliland we're not really concerned with. Basically, sort of the long, and that would be the 7 part. If you think of Somalia looking like a 7, the top line is most of that is Somaliland, the self-declared independent Republic of Somaliland. So mostly we're going to be talking about, if you can see sort of in the middle of the map, the region of Galgaduud and the region of Mudug, south. So this is the areas where Al-Shabaab is the strongest. It has a presence in the north, in the Bari region, but the governance activities are really limited to sort of the central, the western, southwestern, and the southern parts of the country. So that's what we'll be talking about. You can see Mogadishu, sort of spelled in the Somali way. It's in English. And particularly from Mogadishu south is where they're the strongest. So this is an approximation of sort of the current status quo. It is misleading in some way, not intentionally. It's very difficult, probably impossible to really come up with a map that's super accurate because there are basically 3 categories or 4 categories really of territory in the regions of parts of Somalia that we're talking about. There are regions that are on a day-to-day basis controlled by Al-Shabaab, which are governed where Al-Shabaab has a daily presence. There are then, on the other side of the ledger, there are regions such as Mogadishu, where the internationally recognized federal government of Somalia, or the FGS, has day-to-day rule, though, like in Mogadishu or in the city of Baidoa in the west. But the big caveat is that Al-Shabaab is still capable and does operate essentially with impunity, even in the heart of the federal capital of Mogadishu. So government control has a day-to-day sort of governing control, but it doesn't mean that Al-Shabaab is not present, or that ISIS, the Islamic State branch in Somalia, is also not present. And the third category are basically essentially no man's land, areas where both the governments in Al-Shabaab, as well as sort of third-party clan forces, clan militias, clan groups, exert control, and nobody has sort of a daily control that Al-Shabaab could move in, once or twice a week and then move out, and government and African Union forces can do the same. And then the fourth category are territories. Somalia is a federal republic, so there are 5 semi-autonomous member Somali states. Each have their own presidents and their own parliaments, so they are somewhat similar to our state system, but the regional states have much more power than, for example, the governor of Virginia does. And right now, one of the issues that has continues to benefit Al-Shabaab is that the federal member state presidents, or at least half of them, and the federal government, the Somali federal government, are engaged in basically competition for power over the issue of federalism, natural resources. And so that has led to a breakdown in their cooperation from the regional to the federal level against Al-Shabaab, which has really allowed Al-Shabaab to continue to flourish, relatively speaking. So it's November 14th in 2008. And there's a key Somali port city of Marka on the map, sort of highlighted to the south with the from Google Maps with a little pin. So it's about less than 60 miles actually from the federal capital of Mogadishu. And the Somalian Jihadi insurgents or rebel organization Al-Shabab has swept across much of southern and western regions of the country since it emerged in the year before, in 2007, as a fully independent group from the ashes of the Islamic Courts Union, or the ICU, which was an umbrella organization of local Sharia courts and clan militias and sort of Somali Islamist figures that had coalesced in the early 2000s, and between 2005 and 2006 had succeeded in defeating many warlords and cracking down on piracy in Mogadishu and parts of southern and western parts of the country. So Al-Shabaab officials and commanders gather hundreds of local residents from Marka into the public square for the required, according to Islamic law, the required communal Friday prayers, and which also include 2 short sermons. So gathering local civilians in the main square of the city, one of the insurgents' founding leaders, who has since defected and left the group, a man named Mukhtar Robo, better known as Abu Mansour, announces the dawn of a new socio-political order, which will be based on Al-Shabaab's interpretation of Islamic law, or Sharia, and jurisprudence, or fiqh. So this new political legal order, he says, will be based in particular on Al-Shabaab's reading of Islamic penal law, the sort of criminal law, laying the groundwork for a more ordered society, this is what he says, following over a decade of civil war and destructive warlordism and clanism, which had begun in the late 80s and reached sort of an apogee of the collapse of the central state in 1991 with the deposal and the flight of Siad Barre, the president of Somalia, general and sort of authoritarian president of the country. And after his ouster in 91, the country is basically split along sort of clan militia lines. So the militias are primarily based on clan identity. So Robo Abu Mansour invokes not only a common Somali ethnic identity of the audience, of the gathered residents of Marco, but also their shared religion of Sunni Islam. So basically, to be Somali, Somalia is 99.4% or more Sunni Muslim. So that to be Somali is to be Muslim, but Al-Shabab places a greater emphasis on the religious identity. So Robo, really the speech, the sermon that Robo gives on November 14th is really could be said to be the formal start of Al-Shabaab's new proto-state governing project. It expresses an interest in becoming a proto-state or a quasi-state, a rebel proto-state in 2008, and it has continually had one to some degree since that time. So we're talking now over 12 years. So just to put in perspective, with ISIS, which had one for 3 or 4 years and basically at this point has lost all of it, essentially, certainly in Syria and Iraq. So Al-Shabaab during that same period has maintained it. There are reasons for that, which we can talk about perhaps in the Q&A. I'll talk about a little later as well. So this restructuring of Somali society by Al-Shabaab would be achieved by building a defined and bureaucratized, yet also flexible, system of civil governance, one which takes into account or took into account to some degree local sensibilities and interests while also pursuing the insurgents' utopian ideas of Islamist universalism. So locals only had to fear punishment, Robo said, if they violated the sanctities of God, quote unquote, and his law, the Sharia, which gave locals an understandable framework, sort of parameters to guide their relations with their new rulers. Now, this was something that had been lacking previously under many of the clan-based warlords and militias that the Islamic Courts Union, the ICU umbrella, had either co-opted or defeated between 2004, 2005, and 2006. So across southern Somalia on that same day, on November 14th, 2008, other Al-Shabaab officials, in addition to Robo, including one of the senior co-founders of Al-Shabaab, a man named Ibrahim Al-Afghani, that's a nickname because he had spent some time in Afghanistan in the 1990s, made similar announcements, basically marking the start of the insurgent group's experiments with territorial governance, with setting up a civil administration. So to ground their governance ambitions in an aura of socio-historical and religious legitimacy, Al-Shabaab drew on the power of symbols and symbolic repertoires or collections of symbols that invoked Somali's shared ethnic and religious identity as well as their history. These were further infused with an attempt to secure a pan-Islamic or a transnational identity centered on the concept of the idealized global Muslim community, something that called the Ummah, this concept of the Ummah, this sort of ideal, unified, Sunni, I should say, Muslim global community. This appeal was made to give the insurgents a leg up, basically, against their clan-based rivals, so the clan militias, for example, or the clan warlord militias, without negating the continued resonance of clan identity. So Al-Shabaab wanted to sort of reposition or reshape Somali clan identity, but not get rid of it, because its leadership understood and still understands that this is A, it would not be possible, and B, that clan identities still have a very powerful resonance in the country. And so if we could go, and the other thing I'll mention a bit later, this concept of hisba, which basically sort of in short in this context means a kind of regulation of public behavior, is one of the things that Al-Shabaab then and now emphasizes as sort of one of the cornerstones of how it seeks to organize society. So just a bit about the study, why study this sort of Islamist rebel governance. So the advent and the continuing relevance, I argue, in today's world and global politics of Islamist rebel governing projects, ISIS, of course, is the most, probably the best known, which includes the emergence of rebel proto-states like that of the Islamic State, the so-called Islamic State, in Somalia, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, parts of West Africa and the Sahel. Afghanistan, of course, the Afghan Taliban is probably the best example in terms of a proto-state Islamist rebel proto-state governing project. This issue of Islamist rebel governing projects has become more important. This has sort of partly coincided with the sort of growth in the scholarly or the academic literature about rebel governance, but despite the growing number, this is starting to change, but despite making up a growing number of the rebel groups today who are actively experimenting with civil governance, Islamist rebel groups, insurgent groups, have received relatively less attention in the literature than as case studies than other groups, Marxist groups or sort of ethnic or ethno-nationalist rebel groups. So more specifically, in the context of Somalia and East Africa more broadly, Al-Shabaab, just to mention again, has had over a decade now, since 2008, as a major governing power in Somalia and primarily in Somalia, but also to some degree in parts of Kenya. And the advent of multiple other Islamist insurgent experiments with territorial rule around the globe, I argue, offers an opportunity to connect the empirical case studies of these groups, these Islamist rebel proto-state groups, with the growing academic literature on rebel governance and civil war, these literatures. So by doing this, the study of Islamism and specifically forms of militant Islamism or Islamisms, there are different types, which are often popularly referred to, we could call jihadism, sort of Sunni jihadism, can be increasingly situated, I think, within the broader study of again, civil war, rebellion, social movements, and political violence. Connecting sort of the empirics of these specific cases, and then also looking at, what are the similarities and differences between sort of Muslim and Islamist and non-Muslim rebel groups. My arguments, I would argue, certainly at this point, that the social processes, the vocabularies are different, the sets of symbols are different, but the social processes of organization, of mobilization are essentially the same. There's nothing particularly Islamic about them in terms of these processes. Certainly the vocabularies are going to be unique to each case and draw upon sort of cultural and social motifs, historical motifs that will be the most intelligible and most influential on the different target audiences. So the territorial governance projects of Islamist rebel groups, like those of non-Muslim rebel groups, include a wide array of activities, including the implementation, and this is probably the most important, actually certainly the most important, the implementation of systems of social regulation, or kind of law and order, the distribution of material and humanitarian aid, the mediation of civil disputes between members of sort of civil society, for example, in the Somali case, feuding clans and sub-clan groups, and finally carrying out construction and other kind of agricultural public works, if you will, projects. As part of proto-state governance, Islamist rebel groups construct and deploy symbols and symbolic repertoires or collections of symbols that advance their claim to symbolic sovereignty and the legitimacy of their sort of socio-political authority. And they do it in a systematized way, in a systematized language, if you will, which is meant to resonate more deeply with local civilians than a naked display of insurgent power, military power, or armed force, or also more than just a transactional system alone, basically bribing civilians to support them. They do this as well, but they want to do something beyond that. They want to encourage, if not outright cooperation of local civilians or segments of the local civilian population. They also want to, at the very least, convince other sort of independent non-state actors not to rebel against them. In the Somali case, this is very important, even in some of the cases of the Islamic State, because there are very powerful parties, in the Somali case, clan militias, for example, which in many cases outnumber Al-Shabaab and certainly are also quite well armed. So they want to either co-opt them or convince them that it's in their interest not to fight against, this is the Al-Shabaab, the insurgents, not to fight against them. So symbolic power is one way that they do this because it enables the Islamist rebel rulers to push forward governance ambitions and their claims of legitimacy through a defined narrative frame, which imbues them, hopefully, if it works, with added historical, social, and cultural legitimacy through the inclusion or through the use of specific symbols and the performance of certain socio-political rituals, basically political performances, which include the communal religious prayers and festivals, sort of the Friday prayers, the restructuring or the reconstruction of local education systems, and by couching insurgent quote-unquote justice, this is how they term it, within a theological as well as a cultural and a legal framework, that there's a rhyme and reason to the way that their legal system or justice system, again in quotation marks, works. So these organizations and their governing military projects continue to have a profound impact, of course, on the United States foreign policy and international affairs. And so this is one of the main reasons I think that this is also not just an interesting sort of empirical study, but also quite policy relevant. So the book project looks at basically what I would call territorial rebels. So drawing here directly from the idea, the notions by Tilley and others of the territorial state, that basically that the raison d'etre of certainly not all militant Islamist groups, for example, the sort of Al-Qaeda Central or the original Al-Qaeda organization today doesn't really, it may have territorial ambitions, but it really doesn't govern anything. Some of its regional affiliates, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula or AQAP, have, though not really right now. But Al-Shabab, certain ones of them, AQAP, Ansar al-Sharia in Yemen, the Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam wal-Muslimin, JNIM in the Sahel, Islamic State, certain Islamic State affiliates, regional affiliates, all have demonstrated their interest in being territorial powers and not just sort of non-state, sort of terrorist actors carrying out, attacks here and there. So they have definite territorial ambitions. And then apart from sort of, or somewhat alongside perhaps, depending how we classify the Afghan Taliban certainly, of course, have expressed not only an interest in territorial power, but of course, representing both in the 90s and in their incarnation now, the country or the emirate of Afghanistan, the Republic of Afghanistan. So these practices and strategies, or the practices rather and strategies that these territorial Islamist rebel groups use, include first and foremost the implementation of a system of law and order and an explanation of how that works, mediation of civil disputes, basically making the rebel civil administration into or a body that can also insert itself in some cases or present itself as a mediating actor between different social groups. For example, in Somalia, with clan feuds and sort of blood feuds. Development of taxation is very important because they need to fund themselves. Al-Shabab primarily is self-funded through a variety of different, through taxation, through sort of taxation / extortion of businesses, through now investing in property. Even in Mogadishu, there was a property and building boom, things like this. So it has a very diverse sort of set of revenue streams. That's another very important thing that they have to do. And they also want to establish working relationships with key societal actors like clan elders and networks such as the business networks, businessmen and merchants, in order to further ingratiate themselves and insert themselves into society. So they want their pursuit of civilian collaboration, or at the very least acquiescence, don't fight us, don't rebel against us. They want to do this basically because it invests the local population in the rebel project, the governing project, the proto-state projects. Or again, at the very least, it convinces other powerful sort of third-party non-state actors like clan militias not to actively resist the continuance of rebel control, of rebel rule. And it's particularly important because Al-Shabaab, Al-Shabaab has never really numbered. The exact numbers of Al-Shabaab are really unknown. They're debated. But the highest estimates, even at its height in terms of its size, were under 15,000. So we're talking, and at its height, it ruled over 1 million people, territory that was home to over 1 million people. So it is very limited in terms of its size, and of course it has fewer resources, material resources, than the array of opponents that it faces. The FGS, the African Union, or AMISOM, and which is, of course, the FGS is also aided by the UN, by us, the United States, by the EU. So Al-Shabaab has limited resources is the main point there. So by looking at the way that Al-Shabaab frames what's known in social movement studies as the framing processes, and how they are influenced and influence an organization's and by an organization's understanding of territoriality, communal leadership, and the existing international nation-state order, we can understand, I think, more clearly how appeals to Islamic symbols or theology in the sacred past, both Islamic and sort of ethno-nationalist, are shaped by organizational preferences that are specific to the specific geographies, environments, sectarian issues, and communal differences. So just sort of in terms of a lit review, sort of highlighting some of the key literature that I draw upon. So Foundational Studies in Rebel Governance by Jeremy Weinstein, for example, Zachariah Mampilli. I draw upon their definitions of what is rebel governance? Like, when does a rebel government exist? So they point out or highlight three main sort of tasks or things that need to be met before a rebel government can be said to exist. The first is that a rebel government, of course, a rebel group rather, needs to have some territorial control. It has to exercise or have control of some territory to actually govern. So number two, that the rebel group has to then establish institutions to manage relations with civilians. So there are rebel groups that express no interest in really any kind of governance, that yes, they capture territory, but their sole goal or their sole activity remains primarily the military, the insurgent part of the insurgency, and they really they express no interest in actually establishing any kind of civil administration. And number three, that the institutions that the rebel group sets in place, they have to have either formal or informal rules that define a kind of hierarchy of decision-making, kind of a bureaucracy of decision-making, and also, of course, a system of taxation and other kind of civil relations with local civilian parts of the civilian population. So the rebel governance, in quotation marks, refers here not only to these institutions, these sort of administrative institutions and structures that a rebel group sets up, but also to the governing practices that insurgents or rebels adopt, which can be both more formalized or they can be more informal. So a rebel civil administration is formed when insurgents or rebels set up, I'm using these terms interchangeably here, set up a civil affairs apparatus that is distinct from its military organization. That doesn't mean that there cannot be, and in the case of Al-Shabaab, for example, there often is, some fluidity between the military wing and the civil administrative wing, but that there is a separate identifiable civil administration. So there can be overlaps, but there needs to be for a rebel civil administration to exist, there has to be a separate sort of identifiable civilian or civil administration. In the case of Al-Shabaab, for example, the territorial or the provincial governors, which are known as walis, just from as a governor. So the wali has a great deal of authority over civil institutions, religious affairs, political and clan affairs, schooling. But what he often does not have, he does not have direct control of the military sort of forces. There's a distinct military and security leadership which is separate from the shadow governor the offices of the shadow governors. So this is just an example in the case of Al-Shabaab. So the extent to which the rebel group sort of allows local or pursues local civilian participation can vary. It can vary over time as well, so it can change. And that Weinstein, for example, Jeremy Weinstein argues that rebel groups that have a great deal of external resources, basically that a lot of most of their finances and funding come from either sort of lootable natural resources domestically, or they have a lot of external funding from for example, an external state, that they as a general rule, they are much less interested and concerned about what local civilians think of them. They tend to be more predatory because they don't rely on civilian cooperation or acquiescence to continue to thrive, basically. Al-Shabaab is somewhere in the middle. It doesn't need all of the local civilian populations in the areas it controls to support it or even to acquiesce to it, but it does need buy-in or cooperation or acquiescence from certain very influential segments of the population. So through its history, Al-Shabaab leadership has made has tried in particular to forge relationships and cooperative relationships with Somali businessmen, primarily business people, merchants, as well as some clan groups, both sort of more major clans as well as some of the minority communities, which historically have been more marginalized sort of in Somali society. So rebel governance, it can include a wide range of activities. It also includes, importantly, and this is really what I'm really interested in terms of the project, the demonstration of power, political power, military power, social power, through symbolic actions which are meant to underline a rebel group's claim to political legitimacy, as well as to complement the performance of specific political legitimacy claiming acts or political rituals. So even the holding of the Friday prayers is very symbolic for Sunnis, for not just Sunnis, but in the group in power or the ruler, the host of the Friday prayers is very important. So the naming of the ruler, the invoking of the name of the ruler or the rulers during the Friday prayer sermons are very important. It's a symbolic act. It's meant to underline the social, religious, and political authority of the ruler in this sort of group setting. It's something that we can go all the way back to medieval Islamic history and see that when there were changes in dynasties, one of the first things that the new dynasty, the new rulers would do is they would change the invocation in the Friday prayer to the name of the new ruler or the new ruling family. So again, also as a general rule, Al-Shabaab, this is certainly the case. They most often, have fewer human, material, and financial resources than their state opponents. The financial side of this is a bit different in the case of Al-Shabaab, but so they face basically the challenge. How do they use already limited resources to both continue to wage their rebellion insurgency and then to also establish a civil governing administration? And so they do so, Al-Shabaab, through events. For example, the picture at the top is a meeting between Al-Shabaab officials and local clan elders. And also the branding is important. So we see that they have their own coffee cups. This is in Bay and Bakul, which are two regions in the west of Somalia. So the establishment of this kind of proto-state governance, it doesn't mean that it's good governance or that it's fully effective. It does have to have some level of effectiveness to succeed in achieving what a group like Al-Shabaab wants, but it doesn't need to, for example, match even the governance of the state that the rebel group is challenging. In the case of Al-Shabaab, though, there is an argument to be made, for example, that Al-Shabaab in many ways, and this has been true for many years, actually operates in some areas more effectively in terms of actually doing things. Whether those things are good or bad is a different question, but that they actually have a working civil court system, whereas the federal government, the FGS, does not. That the Al-Shabaab is willing to enforce its civil rulings of its courts when the federal government, as well as the sort of the clan-based sort of local clan courts, are not. And also, if you're from a minority community, from either a minority ethnic group or a mixed ethnic group or a lower caste or clan group, that you are more likely to be treated even-handedly than if you go to, for example, a local clan-based court, which is going to be dominated by the most powerful clan in whatever region that you're in. You're more likely to get a quote-unquote a fair shake, so to speak, at an Al-Shabaab court, even if you don't particularly like Al-Shabaab. So there are many cases where, and there have been similar things happened in Afghanistan, for example, with the Afghan Taliban courts, where sort of whether you like, as a local civilian, the Taliban and its interpretation of Islam is beside the point. If you and I have a land dispute, in the case of Somalia, there's really nowhere to go. If you live in Mogadishu or on the outskirts of Mogadishu, there's really not a functioning FGS civil court system. So you go to an Al-Shabaab court because A, it exists, and number two, that say I take your land, I took a part of your land, you bring a case against me in an Al-Shabaab court. They say, yes, Chris, you took his land, so you have to give that back, and you have to pay him a monetary sort of indemnity punishment, and then I don't do it. Well, the Al-Shabaab court will, not only does it have the capacity, it also has the willingness to enforce the ruling, which is something that would not be the case in the case of a federal FGS court. So this is how they sort of convince. So it's both symbolic sort of demonstrations of we're legitimate because of X, Y, Z reasons, and also that we are at least more effective or as effective as other alternatives. In the case of Al-Shabaab and in the Somali case of either the FGS or some of the state, the semi-autonomous federal member state clan-based courts, that you'll get a better result, a better shake, a fairer shake with us than you will with them. And so it's in your interest, this is me, the rebel administrator, to the civilian population, that it's in your interest that we continue to, that you at least continue to have options, right? So in many cases, even today, there are many communities and clan and sub-clan groups that have members in both the federal government or the regional state governments, as well as in Al-Shabaab, because then they have access to all sides and they have a voice or sort of an indirect representative on all sides. So the most effective type of rebel governance, and this is what all of the groups, Al-Shabaab in particular, has tried to do, is first they have to develop an effective police force or a security environment, sort of a police maybe in quotation marks, but basically a domestic force which is tasked with maintaining sort of law and order apart from the insurgent activities. Number two is that they have to develop a dispute resolution process. It can be formal or ad hoc, which is not only that it doesn't only have to exist, people actually, civilians actually have to use it. Al-Shabaab has succeeded in doing this, that it has a more formalized system through either one of its local courts or through its civil administrations in the different provinces or regions that will call together, for example, two feuding clan groups and act as a mediator and also as a guarantor of an agreement. A bit later, I'll talk about it, just to give you a specific example of one case of that. And then three, that they have to provide locals with public goods which are beyond security, something more than just law and order, but such as education, some semblance of healthcare, food, or humanitarian aid. This doesn't have to be extensive, but it has to be it is important to do this in some degree. The way that Al-Shabaab does this is that it collects what's known as in Islamic law zakat, which is a mandated charity if you have a certain amount of liquid wealth at the end of the year, or in case if you're a pastoralist, if you have a certain number of livestock, you have to pay, donate or pay this zakat tax of, if you have 4 adults, female camels, I don't actually know but you have to give a certain one of them, or you have to give some other sets of animals as your zakat. So this Al-Shabaab collects this and then redistributes it, to poorer members of the community, and then also to fund itself in its sort of civil operations. It distributes, for example, during the 2011 famine. On the one hand, it prevented international aid organizations from freely operating in its territory, which significantly harmed local civilians. But at the same time, it also, and I think in part the reason that it did that was so that it could broadcast and advertise and run, which it did, its own sort of humanitarian, quote unquote, or aid programs, which is something that it did and has done subsequently. And just the picture. So, the law and order issue, this is the top picture is actually something from Islamic State, and literally the court police. And on the bottom is one of Al-Shabaab's courts in central Somalia in, I think, 2012. So what's the role of ideology? Ideology is important. I would argue that in the case of particularly Jihadi groups and Islamist groups more generally, that ideology sometimes is in a way, overemphasized in the sense that it is often talked about, this is changing, thankfully, but that it's still often talked about as if ideology is unchanging, that it's something which exists sort of apart from everything else about an organization. So without negating its importance, ideology is certainly important, but just to emphasize that it draws upon, even in the case of Islamist groups and Jihadi groups specifically, Islamist groups more generally, Jihadi groups more specifically, that it draws not only from religion, but from also pre-existing sociocultural identities, from local power relations and histories and specific dynamics of a particular conflict. And also, of course, the organizationally specific goals, so that even if it's expressed in sort of solely or mostly theological or religious language, that it draws upon these other aspects of identity, of individual and organizational group identity. So it's multifaceted, basically. And that it can also change, that it changes over time, for example, depending on the experiences, losses, failures, successes of the organization, that their ideology can evolve, can morph, perhaps, can devolve as well. It can become, in the case of Islamic State, arguably among segments of ISIS, it became more extreme, if that was possible, and it was, where they began to segments of ISIS began to sort of excommunicate other groups because they said they weren't satisfactorily ideologically or theologically pure enough. And this particularly happened when they were rapidly losing territory in 2017, 2018, so that this can change organizational sort of priorities and an organization's ideology. So symbols and these symbolic repertoires or collections of symbols and the framing processes, they allow Islamist rebel organizations like Al-Shabab to deploy a kind of soft power to augment their already limited military forces. Again, Al-Shabab has probably never exceeded 14 or 15,000 members. Today, the estimates are really that they have less than 10,000 sort of card-carrying, if you will, members. So they rely on cooperation and support from people who are not formally members of the group. And so this is, and the framing process and the use of symbols to convince local civilians, even if you don't join us, you should work with us in at least certain arenas. It's to your benefit. This is very important for Al-Shabaab and for other groups to do. So the narrative framing can also, it can be multivocal. Basically, it can have different messages for different audiences simultaneously. It also can deliver a set of messages, different messages to the same audience. And they basically, the culture is, and this would be Somali sort of history, sort of specifics to Somali, the clans, sort of clan identity, that there's what social movement scholars have called a toolkit or a cultural environment that mobilization frames have to tap into, or they seek to draw upon that toolkit of culture to convince the target audience or audiences to buy into them. This is something called frame alignment. It aligns with the interest of the different target audiences and also resonates with them and convinces them to do, to take certain forms of action. And so this is just the image as an example of the way that Al-Shabaab and supporters try to do this. So on the top is a photograph of Sufi or sort of Muslim mystic fighters who were known as the dervishes, who were led by a man who will come up a little bit, named Muhammad Abdullah Hassan. He was a Somali Sufi leader. He formed a briefly sort of existing independent sort of state with kind of fluid borders in the early 1900s, the early 1900s, 1899 to 1920, called the Dervish State. And he subsequently has become, among all segments of Somali society, not just Al-Shabaab or Islamist, a national figure, because he fought the British, he fought the Italian colonial authorities, and he fought against the Ethiopian Empire, which was had its own sort of imperial ambitions in sort of Somali majority ethnic regions. And so he became a nationalist figure once in the 1950s and 60s, when after Somalia, the Republic of Somalia, became independent as one of this kind of proto-nationalist fighter. So the way that Al-Shabab draws upon him in this poster or image, for example, is basically saying that Al-Shabab are the dervishes of today, that just like the Muhammad Abdullah Hassan and the dervish state fought against the crusader invasions of the past, that Al-Shabab are basically their descendants. Excuse me. So the rebel governance is shaped by a combination of ideology and the interaction of rebel organizations with a variety of other social and political actors. In the case of Al-Shabab, this is the business classes, or the merchant class, the business and merchant classes, and the clans, primarily, clans and subclans. Rebel governance is not it doesn't stop evolving. It's an evolutionary process, and it involves multiple variables and concurrent processes, which can change, of course, during the course of a conflict. So symbolic repertoires and symbolic power allow Islamist rebel rulers like Al-Shabab to explain and justify their proposed social and political order and practices by claiming legitimacy and authority through specific narrative frames, that we are exercising this kind of power because of, which is historically and religiously legitimate because of XYZ, that the Prophet Muhammad did this, or that the early Muslim states did this. And it's the way that we interpret Islamic law and jurisprudence, that it's something that we as the territorial rulers have a right to do. So by doing this successfully, they try to invoke their interpretation, of course, but of Islamic law, of Sharia, and other Islamic moral and ethical codes. So, for example, in encouraging people to pay their zakat, their religiously mandated charitable tax, if it applies to them, that it's also not only it's a legal responsibility, but it's also a moral and an ethical responsibility, and something that will benefit the community as a whole. And by doing this, if they succeed in doing this, and certainly their attempts to do this are so that they don't have to actually utilize and expend as many resources in coercion, in sort of coercive action, and that basically civilians were essentially voluntarily perform these acts and kind of self-police or police themselves. So these symbolic processes, the holding, the running of the courts, the holding of these public events, like the big congregational celebrations and prayers, like in the picture above and below, actually, of the two major Muslim festivals, annual festivals, Eid al-Adha and Eid al-Fitr, the last which closes the month of Ramadan, is something that Cynthia Weber has called the performative state, that states seek to produce a specific kind of subject or citizen through repeated enactments of coded normative behaviors and frames, that they try to emphasize, create a certain kind of citizen or a certain kind of subject in the case of Al-Shabaab by emphasizing certain processes and actions. So there are two types, very briefly, of symbols. There are referential symbols, which are connected basically to demonstrating the bureaucratic and coercive power of the rebel state, of the proto-state. These include rituals of governance, the running of the courts, for example, public executions, the big festivals like the Eid celebrations, official costumes and uniforms. So Al-Shabaab's frontline fighting forces wear a kind of uniform, certainly. So do its police forces or its security forces. And then condensation symbols, which basically are sort of what we could think of as cultural kind of things. So flags, poetry, storytelling, different kinds of media, billboards, the naming even of signs of buildings, of schools. This is something that Al-Shabaab, that Islamic State and that most of the Islamist sort of rebel groups do, that they, when Islamic State took over Raqqa and began renaming streets after, Osama bin Laden was one of them, for example, or, companions or close associates of the Prophet Muhammad. These are all kinds of condensation symbols. And that symbols can also be multivocal, which basically they can have multiple meanings to different audiences, or also different meanings simultaneously to the same audience. So symbols can also be reframed. So symbols, even though they draw upon culturally resonant sort of motifs, or they can be recast or in a way dehistoricized. And basically they do this in an attempt to create a new sense of identity that claims legitimacy by invoking a kind of idealized vision of history or a kind of idealized historical memory. So one scholar, Caspar Hoffman, calls this process or this attempt myths set in motion. And basically what goes on there is that they have a much broader reading of identity, so that they draw upon these historical motifs, but then they try to redefine them. So for example, Al-Shabab draws upon sort of Somali cultural and historical identity, but attempts to reshape it and emphasize sort of the religious aspects of it much more than existed actually historically. And so they draw upon sort of historical motifs and Somali history, but they then attempt to sort of reshape it and emphasize much more a certain and also not only a religious identity, but or the religious aspects of it, but a very particular interpretation of religion, because Al-Shabaab's interpretation of Sunni Islam is not normative, historically speaking, in Somalia. So they understand that, and they attempt to address that through these political rituals and also particularly for younger generations by gaining control and reshaping the education system. So they basically, in many ways, they do what many certainly states, not only authoritarian states, but certainly some of the more authoritarian states in the Muslim world, majority world, by having a kind of official Islam, official religion, so that this is the version of Islam that is the endorsed version of what it is to be a Sunni Muslim, a Somali Sunni Muslim. This is how Islam should be practiced. This is the kind of Islam that we're going to promote. So it's very similar to what some state actors do. It's not really that different in terms of putting forward this kind of quote-unquote official Islam. They draw upon one of the ways that Al-Shabaab attempts to reshape historical memory and historical identities, but still draw upon their symbolic power, is with people like Muhammad Abdullah Hassan, who fought the British and the Italians and the Ethiopian Empire, whom the British dubbed the Mad Mullah because he was so confounding to them and annoying to them for 21 years. People like Muhammad Abdullah Hassan, another figure, Hassan Barsane, who fought the Italian sort of fascist colonialism in the 1920s, and another man, Bashir Yusuf, who rebelled against British colonial rule right after the end of World War II in 1945-46. All three of these individuals were Sufi Muslims, Sufi mystics. Al-Shabaab is opposed to Sufism. It views it as a kind of Sufi practices, popular practices like the visitation of shrines and the graves of dead holy men and holy figures, sometimes women, but primarily men in the Somali case, as a kind of polytheism. So this would seem to be sort of strange that they invoke the symbolic power of these individuals who have become nationalist figures among broad segments of Somalis. But what they do is they reshape them. They emphasize the fact basically that they fought against foreign forces, and they kind of either ignore, in some cases they totally ignore the fact that all three of these individuals were Sufi mystics and who practiced Islam in a way that Al-Shabaab rejects. They just kind of ignore that, and they emphasize that they were great, mujahid, fighters and against foreign rule and foreign interventions or foreign incursions. So this is one way that Al-Shabaab tries to sort of reshape sort of his Somali historical figures. So part of the project is, I'm particularly interested in looking at how this kind of framing and framing processes are done with regard to violence, basically by enacting a kind of violence, but a particular kind of violence which is aimed at social control. So basically by convincing, either through enacting of state or proto-state violence, or even more favorably for the rebel group to basically convince them not to do the offense in the first place. How do rebel groups like Al-Shabaab, like Islamic State, we could expand it to the Afghan Taliban or other groups as well, how do they explain the kind of sort of law and order, in quotation marks, violence that they enact. That there is some level of, there are some rebel groups that don't try to explain their violence at all. Sort of the most infamous or famous or infamous example would be the Lord's Resistance Army, Joseph Kony. The kind of violence, there was really no, certainly on the surface, intelligible rhyme or reason to the kind of violence that the LRA would enact. So Al-Shabaab, certainly Islamic State to some degree, certainly they make some attempt to at least frame why certain individuals are being punished the way they are. So these are just two sort of pictorial examples. The first is punishment for someone who's committed fornication or illicit sexual actions, ba'd ihsan, so after they've reached the stage of being culpable. So if someone is not an adult, if someone is has mental issues, they're not considered to have reached that, they're not held accountable because they can't be accountable. So this person has, and that the punishment, the ruling of the Islamic State court was to stone them until death. Sort of literally, that's what it says. The bottom is the punishment of someone who a practitioner of magic, black magic, which is associated with a kind of apostasy. It's literally what it says, that execution of apostasy, the strike of a sword, which draws upon sort of a report purportedly from the saying of Muhammad, of the Prophet Muhammad. So, but basically that there is some, even if it's very limited, some attempt to explain why certain kinds of governing violence is being enacted. And also basically that they want to delineate a kind of parameters for what is acceptable behavior, and in the hopes of that they won't have to exert as many resources in terms of enforcing it. So the Islamist rebel rulers attempt to legitimize their selective use of violence by invoking key Islamic tenets. This is sort of a form of kind of trying to legitimize and explain why they're doing it. They invoke a very key concept of the public good, or maslaha in Arabic, or Islamic legal terminology, the public good. And they emphasize a certain number of sort of key tenets or concepts. The first is justice, or adl. So adl is just that sort of mimicking or reenacting what Muhammad did, what they believe that Muhammad did as head of the first Muslim community, and also the justice of God, that God is the most beneficent, the most merciful, and the most just. Second is the very key tenet to not just Al-Shabab, to sort of Muslims in general, which is known as commanding the right, or enjoining the good and forbidding the wrong, or forbidding the evil. This is that all Muslims have a responsibility to encourage their fellow Muslims to be the most moral, most ethical people that they can be, and that if you see a fellow Muslim who is doing something that is immoral, that is sort of against God's law, the Sharia, that you're supposed to, at the very least, speak to him or her and encourage them to enjoin the good, to basically encourage them to change their ways. The way that many, certainly the Jihadi groups and some Islamist groups interpret this is much more physical, which is that they should set in place laws, for example, that where commanding the good and forbidding the wrong are actually physically done in some cases. Sort of very, very closely related to that is this concept of hisba, again, this verification. It has both a moral, social moral, and an economic meaning. Historically, it basically the person who did the hisba, known as a muhtasib, the muhtasib would be kind of like a market inspector. He would go into the public market, and he would not only sort of make sure that people behave correctly, but that he would also make sure that merchants, for example, didn't try to price gouge. So he had kind of a dual role, historically speaking. So the two main areas of Islamic law, of Sharia, that particularly the sort of the Islamist rebel proto-state groups like Al-Shabab draw upon. The first and most important in terms of this law and order, sort of social order, goal is the penal law. There are different parts of it. One, which is probably the best known, are called a set of ordinances or offenses, which are known as the hadud or the had offenses. These are offenses which are considered offenses against God, against God's law, and for which there are specific punishments laid out in either the Quran or in the Hadith, these collections of reports which are attributed to the Prophet Muhammad's sayings and actions. A part of that is something known as qisas, which is a kind of punishment in kind. So, for example, if I kill your brother and I'm found guilty, then the ruling, depending on the situation, if it's not, if it wasn't in self-defense or something, would be you as the family members could choose between two punishments. The court would give you a choice of qisas, had qisas, or the sort of punishment in kind, which means execution because I killed your brother. Or you could accept a monetary payment known as diya, blood money, basically, a monetary payment as restitution. You can choose as the family one of those two. That's qisas. And something which is not, it's under the penal code, but it's something known as tazir. Tazir is basically offenses that are not had offenses, they're not hudud offenses. So, for example, they're discretionary. The punishment is discretionary up to the judge. And the only ruling is that the judge cannot exceed the punishment for an equivalent had crime. So, for example, if I steal a pack of gum from a store, for the theft normally would be a had crime, but only if it's above a certain amount. So if it's a pack of gum and it doesn't reach the minimum amount, then it's a discretionary or a tazir offense. And then the literal hand being cut off would not be the punishment. It would be probably like a flogging, like I would be hit with a heavy rubber hose in the case of ISIS, and be publicly embarrassed. I might have to wear a placard that said I'm a thief or something. So that's an example of a tazir punishment, an offense. Number two, which is very important as well in terms of sort of warding off rebellion, is something called the ahkam, or the rulings of bughat, which is just rebellion or sort of illegitimate violence against the state. So groups like Al-Shabab invoke both of these two in trying to maintain both every sort of day-to-day law and order, and then also to prevent sort of more dangerous to them rebellions by third-party independent groups, for example. So the way that Al-Shabaab and other groups, ISIS and other sort of Islamist rebel proto-state groups, what they do is they transform Islamic law, the Sharia, into a political tool. So it's not just something which is meant to guide religious and moral behavior, as it is to most Muslims, sort of mainstream, if you will, Muslims, but it's something which is very clearly a political tool. And it's also a tool of statecraft. It's how a group like Al-Shabaab seeks to realize its territorial ambitions and literalize the implementation of the law of Sharia in a way that really did not exist. And this is something I think which is very important. Certainly all of the jihadi groups and many of the Islamist groups, the non-militant Islamist groups, the way that they interpret Islamic law, the way that they interpret sort of the combination of what they see as religious and political, it did not exist historically. It is very new. It is very post-Enlightenment. It is very modern. It did not. Historical Muslim states did not do this. They did not consider religious and political authority the same thing, and that the secular rulers historically of Muslim states, empires, kingdoms, emirates, etc. The secular political authorities were always higher than the religious authorities. So the law of the ruler, the law of the sultan, if you will, was always took precedence over the law of the Islamic law, over the law of the clergy. The ruler could determine what he wanted to do, and the rulers were never religious figures. They were not religious clerics. They were not religious scholars, theologians. They were primarily military or political elites, tribal elites. So ironically, the sort of modern Islamists in general, and certainly the jihadis or the militant Islamists, seek to basically their reading of state power, of the relationship between politics and religion is something which is completely modern and very ahistorical in terms of Islamic history. It's just kind of an interim. So this is one of the things that Al-Shabab does in terms of its civil governance. This is its main charity or its social services public works organizations called the Jamiat al-Ihsan, really just a charitable organization for good, al-Khairiyya. It cites a hadith, a saying attributed to Muhammad about this is for digging a new sort of well. Water is very important, of course, because there are Somalia and other and East Africa in general has routine problems with droughts. So this is just an example of one of Al-Shabaab's sort of public works, if you will, projects. So just a very very quickly go over sort of the general sort of bureaucratic structure, organizational structure of Al-Shabaab, having said sort of the more sort of theoretical groundwork. So that the top of the organization is known as the Amir. He is the ultimate head of the organization, both the civil wing and the military wing. The Amir of Al-Shabaab right now is a man named Ahmad Omar, known as Abu Ubaidah. So Abu Ubaidah is at the head. He has a Shura Council, or a consultative sort of council of advisors. The role of the Shura Council in Al-Shabaab was more important in its earlier history. It's fluctuated in terms of its importance. So Abu Ubaidah's successor really had changed and relegated the Shura Council to a much less important role than had existed previously. So under the Amir and the Shura Council are the regional governors, or the shadow governors, known as walis. They control the different regions, sort of the civil administrations of the different regions that Al-Shabaab has a governing sort of control over segments of it. So if we think back to the map at the very beginning, the Galgaduud and these different regions, lower and middle Shabelle regions, so more or less they've stuck with those sort of provincial or territorial boundaries. And so each of them has a regional governor. When Al-Shabaab controlled some of the major cities, for example, the most important port city in Somalia, which is in the far south, it's called Kismayo. When Al-Shabaab controlled that, there was a separate shadow governor for just the city of Kismayo because it was that important. Since it doesn't control sort of areas like that anymore, they did away with that. So the regional governors control all of the individual administrative offices, which have regional branches, which include political and internal affairs. This means relationships with local merchants, with local clan elders, sub-clan elders, offices of taxation and finance, the police, which they call the Jaish, or the army of Al-Hispa, so the army of verification, of the army that does the Hispa. The military, which they call Jaish al-Usra, which literally translates to the army of hardship. It's because of a saying of Muhammad, which is it's tied to Muhammad. The Prophet had a difficulty assembling an army for one of his campaigns, and according to a historical report, Muhammad said, "This is the Jaish al-Usra." And so Al-Shabaab, that's how they connect. Again, this is just another example of how they try to connect themselves to sort of Islamic and or Somali kind of historical things. An office of propagation, religious propagation or missionary work known as Dawa, religious affairs, medical aid, etc., the Jamiat al-Ihsan, the charitable organization, and the judiciary, which is very important. The judiciary includes primarily what a local civilian would mostly encounter would be the localized Sharia courts that Al-Shabaab runs. There is then something at the very bottom called the grievances response, or the Rad Mazalim court, which is, in theory at least, is a court where an ordinary civilian person can go and issue a complaint about a public official for abusing his power. This is something that existed in Islamic history. The Ottomans had it, some of the other caliphates had it. And then in the middle, something called the Amniyat, which literally means security, which is very important in Al-Shabaab. The Amniyat is both a security apparatus. It's kind of a Praetorian Guard that is loyal directly to the Amir, so to Abu Ubaidah in today. And it also is responsible for a lot of the more detailed internal planning, for example, carrying out some of the large-scale multi-stage or multi-pronged suicide assaults in the capital, in Mogadishu and Kismayo, these attacks by teams of gunmen and suicide vehicle bombers, SVBIEDs. So the Amniyat is in charge of all of that in terms of planning and things like that. So it's very hierarchical, it's very centralized, but it also built in is flexibility for the regional governors and for even lower level commanders and officials to make some decision making on their own without having to get the Emir and the Shura Council to sign off on everything, so as long as it fits in within the parameters of the group's sort of overall policies. So just very quickly, this example of mediation. So in April 2016, the Al-Shabaab shadow governor for the lower Shabelle region, which is sort of to the immediately adjacent to Mogadishu, a man named Muhammad Abu Abdullah. So Muhammad Abu Abdullah oversaw a mediation process between two different feuding clans, one the Habergeder and one called the Bimal. They were feuding over land, and that it resulted in some fighting, and then some people had died on both sides. So Muhammad Abu Abdullah, the shadow governor, calls them together and sort of mediates and then serves as the guarantor over an agreement, sort of first a temporary truce and then a sort of a return to the control of grazing land and natural resources, more or less in a kind of equitable or even way that had existed before the conflict, and that Al-Shabaab would act as the guarantor of that, and that both parties, both clans agreed that if one side violated, then that side would be punished in certain ways, would be forced to pay more money, and then would be expelled physically if they violated the boundaries. So what happened after this agreement, though, is it did result in the end of this blood feud or this land feud, but some of the clan elders were then not very happy after the fact, and they complained to Al-Shabaab officials higher than Abu Abdullah, than the shadow governor. And so Al-Shabaab, this presented the senior leadership of Al-Shabaab with the problem, because on the one hand, these clans were very powerful in the region, and they wanted to maintain this good relationship with them. On the other hand, Abu Abdullah is a longtime member, administrator, and they didn't want to alienate him either. So the way that they worked around this problem, potentially damaging problem, is that they basically shifted Abu Abdullah to the governorship of another region. And then, so they satisfied the clan elders who had complained in that area, the lower Shabelle area, and they didn't alienate Abu Abdullah, and they publicly thanked him for serving as the lower Shabelle governor for 7 or 8 years. And so this is the way that they worked around it. But this is how Al-Shabaab's civil administration generally handles these kinds of things, in terms of acting as both not only a distributor of, for example, humanitarian or financial aid, but also as a third-party mediator for clan disputes, some of which have been running for quite some time. It's also something not unique to Al-Shabaab. We've seen this in other ways with Islamic State, AQAP, AQIM, or segments of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, and of course the Afghan Taliban. And below is just the Jamiat Ihsan. This is an eye clinic, actually, that they ran. So the public events are very important. In addition to things like flags and poetry and sort of visual symbols, one of the political rituals are very important. These public events, congregational events, the Eid celebrations, the Friday prayers, other public meetings between Al-Shabaab administrators and clan elders, for example, are very important examples of the kind of ritual demonstration that Al-Shabaab performs to broadcast its claims to legitimacy and also its capacity. So public events, again, like the Friday prayers, the congregational Friday prayers every week, like the 2 Eid celebrations every year. These are types of referential symbols, using the sort of typology we talked about earlier. They certainly invoke symbols from the Islamic sacred history. So again, the Friday prayer is very important symbolically, because the name of the legitimate ruler is read out at these prayers, is acknowledged, and this is very important symbolically. This has been done since the time of Muhammad and the early caliphates, the Umayyad and the Abbasid caliphates. The name of the Abbasid caliph would be read out at the Friday prayers, not just in Iraq, where the caliphate was based, but also in Egypt, in Syria, in other parts of far from Baghdad. And it was because it was a symbolic recognition of his authority, political and also his religious authority. Also at these events, of course, are condensation symbols like flags, like we see above with this group of Al-Shabaab wives, and also their headbands with the Shahada, the testament of faith. There is no God but the one God, Allah. and Muhammad is his messenger. Another very important way that Al-Shabaab and Islamic State certainly did this to a much greater level was reshaping local education systems. So very briefly, in 2011, this is something that predating, sometimes it's assumed that every other sort of Sunni Jihadi sort of rebel group basically just copied ISIS. Certainly ISIS did things, obviously, there's nothing, the capacity of Islamic State, of course, is very unique. But Al-Shabaab actually had expressed a very clear interest in actively reshaping local education, local schools in 2011, so several years before ISIS became ISIS, when it was still the Islamic State of Iraq. Al-Shabaab issues a white paper sort of explaining what it wants to do, why it wants to do it. It's somewhat short on specifics, but it's very clear. It was very clear that they wanted to invest resources and time in doing this. It took them a number of years. In the spring of 2017, I think in April, if I remember correctly, they actually issue new textbooks, which they mandate the usage of in schools that are in areas that they governed. To sort of follow their to sort of reshape education, and then also to really target younger generations of Somalis living in areas where they operate. So another way that they've done this is that Al-Shabaab has and continues to run sort of schools, educational programs, institutes that are targeted at specific youth populations, children, and also adults of specific clans. They run classes, for example, for merchants, for traders in different fields, gold traders, for example, to try to sort of inculcate them with Al-Shabaab's interpretation of Islamic law and then sort of politics. Next slide, please. Oh, actually, sorry, just keep it. So in the bottom, just the interesting thing about the bottom photo is, so the man to the right is a man named Hassan Yaqub Ali, who was then the shadow governor of one of the regions. So one of the things that happens at these public events, this is one of the Eid celebrations, is that locals who attend them have some opportunity to interact with even senior Al-Shabaab administrative officials. So just briefly, I wanted to, since it's very topical, and also related to the governance issues, just to briefly talk before closing about Al-Shabaab's response or responses to COVID. They've been quite mixed. Obviously, the capacity of even the federal governments of Somalia is very limited in terms of combating the spread of COVID because of its limited resources. The federal government relies essentially for almost all of its operating budget from foreign aid, including significant amount of aid from the United States. Al-Shabaab's capacity is even less than that. It has had its response in many ways is typical of the other sort of the Sunni Jihadi responses from Al-Qaeda Central, from the Pakistani Taliban, for example, that they see in large part COVID as the pandemic as a kind of divine punishment, not only on non-Muslims, but also on Muslims, because Muslims, they say, have erred from sort of the correct moral path, and this is one of the ways that God is punishing sort of the world sort of at large. But they do acknowledge that it is also more, in a more worldly sense, that it is a significant potential threat, not only to their sort of governance, but also to sort of public health. And I say that it's mixed because on the one hand, they have put some things in place to sort of increase sort of the resources that they'll dedicate to running these sort of traveling medical clinics, for example. But then on the other hand, they have refused to even temporarily shut down mosques and schools. And on top of that, they've criticized the FGS and the Somali semi-autonomous state governments for doing so. So it's a very mixed approach. It has not run, to my knowledge at least, what, for example, the Afghan Taliban has done, which is clinics and educational sort of information sessions, if you will, specifically devoted to COVID and how to sort of safeguard against that. To my knowledge, from what I've seen, Al-Shabaab has not done it. It's been a kind of very mixed approach. They've also alleged that COVID, again, this is very self-serving and in their interest of basically saying that COVID first came to Somalia because of all of the thousands of foreign troops and foreign forces in the country. And so specifically, they've alleged that the first cases of COVID emerged at the Halain compound, which is where the African Union mission in Somalia, the AMISOM headquarters at the Mogadishu airport. And this is just a photo from a recent conference in mid-March, a 5-day conference between Al-Shabaab administrators and local sort of notables, clan elders, religious scholars, merchants, that covered a number of different issues, including COVID. These events are very important. This is one of the more important ones. You can often tell that because of which insurgent leaders are present. And this one had quite a number of senior and sort of senior mid-level leaders and administrators. So just some concluding sort of remarks. So as part of their and sort of underlining a couple things. So as part of their proto-state governing projects, Jihadi rebel rulers like Al-Shabab, the leadership of Al-Shabab, utilize symbolic repertoires and symbolic power as a form of soft power to advance their organizational claims to sovereignty and to legitimate authority. These repertoires and narrative frames draw upon culturally resonant symbols and motifs, and they try to do this in a systematized way which is meant to lessen the insurgents' need to use coercive violence. They're willing to use, of course, coercive violence. There's no doubt about that, but they want to sort of lessen the need to do that on a regular basis by getting people to kind of abide by the rules voluntarily. So some symbolic repertoires or these collections of symbols allow rebel rulers to advance governing ambitions or governance ambitions and these legitimacy claims, and to do so within this defined narrative frame that attempts to imbue them with this sort of added historical, religious, cultural legitimacy by using and drawing upon specific symbols and political performances or political rituals. It's very important that even though on the surface Al-Shabaab and Islamic State seem very similar, and in some ways they are, that each Islamist rebel group is embedded within their own societies for the most part. ISIS might be somewhat of an outlier to some degree, but most groups are embedded in a very specific and a very unique historical, environmental, geographical context, and understanding this context is as important as understanding sort of the Islamist or the Islamic sort of symbolism and imagery that they draw upon. So I just underlining that the reason it's important to understand the use of symbolic power as a kind of soft power, because it's not through, Al-Shabaab hasn't lasted. To speak specifically about Al-Shabaab, they haven't existed for 12 plus years as a governing power, proto-state governing power, because of their military superiority. The reason that they continue to exist is because of their investments and their recognition that symbolic or this kind of symbolic soft power is as important or more important, in fact, in sort of ingratiating themselves or inserting themselves into the society in which they operate, into which they rely on for money, they rely on for support or acquiescence. There are other reasons we can talk about. It's not the only reason. Al-Shabaab also learned from some of its military or tactical mistakes, which we can talk about if anyone's interested in the Q&A. But one of the ways, the reason that it still exists is not because it has been able to militarily defeat its opponents, because it hasn't been able to do that. I would argue it's because of the recognition that they need to invest in this kind of symbolic power and symbolic governance, or its use for governance. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Dr. Anzalone. And I know, looking at the Q&A or in the chat, sorry, if anyone has a question they'd like to ask Dr. Anzalone, just go ahead and put it in the chat and let me know. I know, Dr. Tarzi, you already indicated that you have a question, so if you want to go ahead and ask it.
Thank you. Dr. Anzalone, Chris, my question is, you talked about the governance, the territoriality of Al-Shabaab. One thing that you did not touch upon that I want to see if you can go into is their foreign relations. I mean, Somalia, importance is because where it is. For the rest of the world, for the United States, it sits in a very, very strategic place in the Horn of Africa, a choke point, and do they have? I know that in Somaliland, for example, has done some agreements with United Arab Emirates. They have even recognized Taiwan, and so they have taken some activities as a state to at least, give some access to some ports. What about the Shabab? Have they done anything beyond just, aid but they have done anything strategic with any other country? Thank you.
Yes, so they have not. They haven't done even something like, as you know, Dr. Tarzi, with the Afghan Taliban, like asserting, these messages to neighboring countries. So Al-Shabaab rejects. On the one hand, they reject the sort of the nation state, but on the other hand, they kind of de facto accept it. They have not, or in an earlier period, there is evidence, for example, the UN Monitoring Group on Somalia and Eritrea has claimed and to some extent documented that Al-Shabaab did receive, or parts of Al-Shabaab. Al-Shabaab has always been somewhat of a segmented organization, meaning that different commanders have had their own agendas. But that they received it in an earlier period, not really in recent years, money from Eritrea, for example, particularly before Eritrea and Ethiopia and Somalia kind of had this rapprochement under Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, that they received some Eritrean money, but basically as a way for Eritrea to kind of mess with Ethiopia, which of course from 2007 to 2009 was inside occupying parts of Somalia, that they receive Eritrean money as a way for the Eritreans to kind of get the Ethiopians. And they, not really foreign relations perhaps, but they have definitely, Al-Shabaab meaning has definitely had direct contacts with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, with AQAP, as early as 2011, 2012, from both the leadership of Al-Shabaab and the leadership of AQAP. They publicly and also behind the scenes not only expressed an interest in helping each other across the Bab al-Manda, but also sending, I know that there have been interceptions of weapons, for example, from Yemen to Somalia, because there's a question about how Al-Shabaab, for a long time, for many years, Al-Shabaab was reliant on smuggling in or capturing weapons and munitions from, the African Union, from Somali government forces, or smuggling them in, like on the black market. In more recent years, one of the more worrying sort of security things is that Al-Shabaab seems to have developed internal capacity to manufacture explosives, higher quality explosives domestically, so that they don't have to smuggle those in. But so they have reached out to other militant groups in other countries, but not really to foreign states. And Al-Shabaab denies, of course, that it's received Eritrean money, though it probably did at some point, at least indirectly.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. I just, as I said, the question I had is because when we look at Somalia within the Marine Corps University and the maritime side, while the Al-Shabaab's reach and governance is important, what they do on the coastal lines and how they conduct themselves within the confines of the very large and very important coastline that Somalia has will have an importance, and specifically because now the United States has mostly withdrawn the forces we had there. They were very small, but with that there's a gap, and what would be for us here within the Marine Corps University and to look at and as to see who's going to fill that gap. I personally don't think that. I mean, Djibouti has made a killing on having as many countries as almost want to have a port in Djibouti. When will that happen in Somalia, and what the role of Shabab will be, is something that I think we need to keep an eye on, because I see Russia and China and even other smaller countries eventually trying to make a deal to have a port access. And because the country, as we heard from Dr. Anzalone, they have managed as a government, if you would. How that manifests itself, I think, would be important, and as we go along into the future of that maritime zone. So that's the thing that I want to look at.
Yeah, actually, let me just add to sort of follow up on Dr. Tarzi's question and comment. So just to address them, I think a little more sort of additional sort of thoughts. So there's definitely interest. I mean, and Al-Shabaab is cognizant as well of, for example, the China's sort of Belt and Road initiative and sort of moving toward, again, wanting, as Dr. Tarzi said, wanting to have access to the Red Sea, and then also the investment, which has already started by companies, some of which are based in the United Arab Emirates, some of which are based in other Gulf Arab countries, in like Qatar, for example, in sort of different ports in Somalia. So, for example, also the maritime disputes between the federal government of Somalia and some of the regional state governments. For example, the Somali regional government in Puntland in the far north, in Bosaso, the port of Bosaso, for example. Al-Shabaab actually has attempted to target some of and in fact has killed, has assassinated a couple of years ago, 2 years ago, I think, 2 or 3 years ago, an official from one of the companies that the UAE-based companies that has invested in Bosaso to sort of develop the port and to sort of have a kind of establish a foothold there. Al-Shabaab, in terms of its maritime activities, has actually in the past year and a half taken, it has a kind of mixed history in terms of its naval operations, so to speak, but it has been much more active in the past year and a half in launching small scale, but sort of attacks on government-controlled islands. In the far south, for example, there's an island called the Kofta Island, which it's attacked a number of times in the last year, sort of 12 months or so, 12 to 18 months. It has, it uses sort of tries to shift forces not only on land but also on the sea, and but it has actually specifically addressed the sort of Chinese projects like Belt and Road, the sort of Chinese projects and investment in and around the Horn of Africa, and sort of it recognizes them, and it seems if they become sort of more of a reality that it will attack them like it has already attacked sort of Kenyan sort of maritime interests in the south, but the offshore oil and gas reserves, and then also in the north, in Bosaso, for example, in Puntland, the Bosaso port.
Let's see. We have I got one question in the chat. I'll go ahead and get to that, and I think we'll close it up, respecting everyone's time. So it's from Andrew Kettner. Andrew, are you able to ask your question?
Can you hear me, Doctor?
Yes.
I appreciate the conversation that could have happened here, but there's just so much to digest. I'm trying to pinpoint my question into a historically based organization like this in that area of the world. How do we as a state actor, or even we as a Marine Corps, or myself as an individual, engage with an organization that doesn't even look at our legitimacy, but definitely has legitimacy itself? Where do we even start? Are we always at a disadvantage no matter what? I appreciate your time. Thank you.
So one of the ways I think that there's some potential is that because Al-Shabaab has been, on the one hand, Al-Shabaab is segmented in the sense that there are different commanders, different leaders that have different interests. Some of them are more or less subscribed to the Al-Qaeda type sort of militant Islamism. Some of them have been, there have been major leaders have defected in the past, either for personal reasons or both personal and sort of ideological or strategic reasons. There is an interesting sort of new set of arguments, which I think have some. They're worth looking at is whether can Al-Shabaab entirely be sort of eradicated? It would be very difficult, but that it is possible to cleave off parts of Al-Shabaab whose interests are. And one of the difficulties, one of the many sort of juggling balls that Al-Shabaab leaders have had to do is to sort of keep people interested with a variety of. So some people are allied with Al-Shabaab, some clans, purely for their own material interests, basically, right? That basically Al-Shabaab is able to provide it with something that the federal government or the regional state governments are not. So that it's possible to cleave away those supporters of Al-Shabaab, which would significantly weaken it. Yeah, there's going to be a core of Al-Shabaab that is not going to, it's not going to change its ideas. But there are even members of Al-Shabaab who it would be easier to, not easier, but would be possible to cleave them away from the core, if you will, from sort of the very diehard core, because many of these people are attracted. A lot of the rank and file fighters are attracted because they're paid regular salaries, which is something that unfortunately doesn't even happen with the Somali National Army, right? There have been many protests by Somali soldiers in the capital in recent years, even because they're not paid regularly. Even African Union troops are not always paid regularly. Like there have been protests by Ugandan, defense soldiers prefer not being paid. But so some of those members of Al-Shabaab, who Al-Shabaab leaders, rely on, are not really. Many of them are not really diehard, sort of ideological, sort of diehard supporters of Al-Shabaab sort of ideology, but they, are members of Al-Shabaab because they get a regular paycheck. I think it's worth looking at how to degrade and sort of undermine Al-Shabaab's activities by focusing on sort of those segments of the organization and also society in which they exist.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Anzalone, and thank you, Andrew, for your question.
Thank you.
So we'll wrap up here. Thanks to everyone in our audience for coming to our introductory lecture by Dr. Anzalone. Like I said, he's a new member of Team Krulak, so we look forward to more items, writings, and lectures coming out here as he gets snapped into the Krulak Center's activities. And this will bring our brewcast to a close for this week. We really hope that you can join us next week because we have a really exciting panel that's coming together. The topic of discussion is turning on a dime, South China Sea scene setting toward taking back their strategic initiative. Our panelists will include Dr. Carlisle Thayer, Mr. Greg Poling, Mr. Drake Long, Ms. Beek Tran, and it will be facilitated by Dr. Leslie Wilhelm. So we hope to see you all then.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.